Hello, this is James from TeaDB. I wanted to talk a little on camera about 3 Dayi teas I had recently. It's often hard to judge these things on the spot when we film, for normal episodes for instance, but many times we're just reading and reacting. So the reactions are honest, which I think is a good thing, but real-time judgments are difficult and even more so on camera. So if you think about things like when you initially react, it may be a little different than when you can sit on it and reflect on it a little bit. In-betweenisodes are usually much of the same, and usually what I try to do on those in particular is I try to both rely on my memory, but also to take some notes and to put some of those notes up and review them before drinking the tea on camera. And sometimes I do think this processing time can be really important. So rather than drinking these teas on camera, I'm going to talk about a few teas that I will not be drinking. I've also finished these 3 teas as they were all samples, which would make drinking them on camera impossible without reordering them. So what is the theme of these teas? So those of you that follow the website, I wrote a report on these 3, which you can read. But the 3 teas are all Menghai Tea Factory productions from an era that isn't covered or talked about in the West from 1997 to 2001. And in our Western scene, a lot of that airspace is really taken up with young Pu'erh. Of the semi-age Pu'erh that does get talked about, some is factory, but that factory tends to be focused on the mid-2000s at the earliest. So why not the earlier teas? Well, for one, they're not really easily available, and when they are, they can be really quite expensive. Speaking for just myself, I own a bit of mid-2000s Dayi and Shagwan, but nothing earlier than 2003. And while I have tasted some earlier stuff, I'd say the vast majority of my experience with factory teas is from a more recent era. These earlier teas also hold interest for me because they're around half a decade older than most of my own teas. Getting these reference points can be informative as using sort of a measuring stick for trajectories and seeing how my own tea is doing. These teas are 1997, 2000, and 2001 respectively, all made by Dayi and were most recently stored in Taiwan. The samples themselves ended up being not quite $2 per gram, so we're talking about pretty pricey tea whole bings, although I suppose if you wanted to justify it, the per session price isn't too crazy. But this episode is really not about price nor about value. It's more just about the teas. So real quickly, because I know some people are curious, where did I get these from? I was lucky enough to purchase a few of these samples from a Taiwanese Pu'erh vendor with a good reputation, and I've included the link to that vendor below. You would need to use a shipping agent. Special shout out to my tea friend Nug for helping to do the communication and coordination of these teas. Okay, so starting with the earliest one, the 1997 Green Mark. So I have no idea how true this is, but I've been told that this at least is somewhat like a 7542. I have just one cake of 7542 from sort of that mid-2000s era, which is, I guess, 8 years younger than this tea. A 2005 504 7542 that is at least somewhat similar to this profile in the sense that I thought of it when I had this tea. So on a very surface, shallow level, I do find that is at least somewhat believable. This tea does seem to have undergone a little more intense storage than the others. It feels softened and very much ready to drink without a lot of the astringency or bitterness. It's really not nearly as dank as some traditionally stored teas that I will drink on occasion. But I would not describe this as totally storage-free and clean either. The tea itself has a wood, earth, fruit, think sort of lychee and long on profile. Can get a little bitter, so you wouldn't ever mistake this for a ripe Pu'erh, for instance, if you push it especially. And I'd say that the depth and the huigan are both solid, pretty good. The tea is not really like an awesome tea in that it really beats you down, but if most of my factory tea turned out like this, I would be satisfied enough. For me, this is a tea I could drink in a number of occasions. Probably the best case would be having it with another tea person like Denny or Garrett. But I could also see drinking this with people that just have some familiarity with Pu'erh, but aren't totally tea crazy. Next up is the 2000 Wild Dayi. For me, this tea doesn't really live up to my expectations of turn of the century Dayi. It's kind of weird and has a sweet hay profile. There's nothing inherently wrong with the flavors, but it is a little too light and also just kind of uninteresting. I think the most damning part for me of this is the lack of strength and potency. It's okay to drink now, and what is lacking in terms of strength and potency makes me a little bit suspect of its future. The storage does seem lighter in contrast with the 1997 green mark, and in my post there was a comment that asked if I thought storage was part of the reason I didn't care for it. So I did think about this, and while I'm not going to completely rule it out, I don't really think it is the storage. Yeah. For me, this is a tea that I might toss in a session where I know we'll be drinking 2 or 3 teas or so, for instance, with someone like Garrett, just to see how it compares and see if my impression remains approximately the same. Basically, to get a second opinion. I can't see myself drinking it a ton otherwise. Finally, for me, the highlight of the batch was the 2001 Purple Dayi, batch number 103. There's a few different batches. Sometimes this is important, sometimes it's less important. But I've been told that the third one is distinctive and possibly better. I do not know. This is what I've been told. I am not an expert in these matters. So this one is definitely the greenest of the 3. Makes sense. It's the youngest. It has a powdery texture that does remind me of some of the Wistaria teas, and there's definitely a little bit of smoke in the tea, especially in the early parts, but in a really nice way, a fairly productive way, so in a way that I do enjoy it. And I'm someone that is normally a little bit put off when teas can be a little bit too smoky. For me, that can sometimes be a sign that I don't want to drink it now and I might want to wait. To me, there are 2 main things that really elevate this tea above the others. Number 1 is the potency. While I do think it's the strongest and the greenest, I think even this and the 1997 had equivalent storage and age, that this tea would be stronger than it. In other words, I think the material is stronger. The tea also has good body and good depth. I do also get some sort of somatic reaction in my body from the tea. It's not like overwhelming or anything, but in both sessions with this, I could feel cha-chi, something I find pretty difficult to tackle in the normal episodes. So that's definitely something that I feel like being able to reflect on helps me to more speak to it a little bit better. The second major attribute that really does make the tea stand out is its really awesome huigan to it. A few steeps in, I was already really enjoying that. The profile might be slightly smoky and a little green and even bitter, but the aftertaste, the depth of sweetness, and how it lingers really reward. So both of these attributes make me enjoy it a lot now and makes me think that this will be potentially an even better tea in the future. So who would I drink this with? For me, this is a tea that I would actually really pick my spots for, unlike the other 2. I'd have it alone if I wanted a really special occasion tea, or I could share it with a group of, fairly select people that I feel like would appreciate it. Unlike the 1997 green, I'd probably, I definitely plan for it and maybe bring it out on a special occasion. I might be willing to drink the 1997 green with someone like my dad who enjoys tea, but really doesn't know all that much. But this I would probably save for people that are a little more serious into tea. Sorry, Dad. Okay, so that's just about it on the 2001 Purple Dayi 103. As I've consumed more and gotten more experienced, one downside is that I do have less experiences where I'm legitimately excited and energized. I think this overall is pretty normal, and it's something I've experienced in other hobbies as well. Once you've seen a lot of things, it's natural to feel a little less awed by things. This made me really appreciate this tea, a tea that really did legitimately get me excited when I did not fully expect it. Despite it being quite expensive. So my expectations were not nothing coming into this tea. So some quick concluding words on these as a whole. I think it can often be pretty easy to lump together tea that we are not that familiar with. After one session, we form certain impressions. Multiple repetitions with the tea or brand can help to create a fuller picture. Approaching these teas has caused a greater appreciation of the difference between productions from this area. Going into this tasting, I knew that turn-of-the-century Dayi has a reputation for firstly being strong and decent. Fair enough. And of course, quite expensive. Now, clearly none of these has been flipped on its head or been proven wrongs. The teas on average were strong, decent, and quite pricey. I'd also say that my impression of them is a little bit more rich and nuanced now that I've had these teas. For instance, there was a fair amount of variation in all three teas, more so than I expected. They're all Dayi within a 4-year time period, but the teas are really quite distinct. For one, there's a big quality difference in how I'd grade all three. The 2000 Wild Dayi was weird. The 1997 was, along the lines of what I expected and very solid. And the 2001 was potent, challenging, and extremely satisfying. This tells me that I should be especially careful not to paint with too broad of a brush when it comes to teas, especially in genres or categories that I am not too experienced in. The final thing is something I've thought about a lot since getting into Pu'erh and deals with what we're talking about when we think we're thinking about aging a tea more. Specifically, the strength and the huigan. If you talk to some people about a famous tea, such as the 1988 Qingbing, one thing I've heard a couple times is that they'll say that the profile and many of the characteristics of the tea has of course changed. The tea has transformed significantly since 1992, for instance. But that huigan has always been there and has stood the test of time, even when the tea was much, much greener. And for me, the better session that I've had with the 1988 Qingbing, I've had it twice, the tea's impressive aftertaste was really my favorite characteristic of the tea. Well, I guess you could say maybe it's hearsay to use that as a measuring stick. The 2001 huigan was very impressive, and I do think it's an important attribute to consider when looking at some of these teas that can be quite strong and maybe not necessarily super approachable or sweet up front. Strength also has been sort of re-emphasized to me as something to think about and look for. This lines up with the impressions I've gotten with far more seasoned and experienced tea people than myself. Anyways, that concludes my thoughts on these teas. I sincerely hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts and opinions on them. I definitely do recommend you try certifiable Dayi teas from this era if you do get the opportunity. I think it's very educational and worth doing if you can do it in a small enough size to make it affordable. And finally, do hit that thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and let me know what you thought of it. Cheers.